How's your mother doing now?
When people have been asking me that question, I say she's okay, but she's not okay.
It began with a voice, fragile, cracked, and trembling, like it was holding onto the last few ounces of strength it had left. "If you're hearing this, Sharon, it means I couldn't make it home." Those words would haunt her for the rest of her life. The voice was unmistakable. It was Ozzy, her husband, her chaos, her miracle. A man who had screamed before millions but now could barely whisper. The air around that recording felt heavy, almost sacred. There were no guitars, no band behind him, just silence and breath. A breath that sounded like it might give out any second. At first, she thought it was some old studio outtake. Ozzy was always recording something, snippets of lyrics, little jokes for the crew, voice notes reminding himself of melodies. But this one was different. The tone, it was final. It was the sound of a man saying goodbye, but not to the world, to the one person who had carried him through it. When fans heard a small piece of it months later, they cried. The internet called it Ozzy's last message. But for Sharon, it wasn't content. It was closure she never asked for, and it began in the most ordinary way. A hospital room, Lowe's Angels, late evening, machines humming soft and steady. Ozzy lay there, pale, thinner than she'd ever seen him. The light from the monitor flickered over his wedding band, the same ring she'd slipped onto his finger in Maui decades ago. Sharon sat beside him, her hand resting over his. For once, the man who had filled stadiums with noise was surrounded by nothing but quiet. He turned his head slowly, eyes still sharp behind the exhaustion. "You look scared," he whispered. She smiled, even though her throat burned. "I'm not scared," she lied, but she was, terrified actually. Because for the first time in their entire marriage, she felt him letting go, not emotionally but physically. There's something chilling about watching someone you love start to drift away while they're still right in front of you. It's not like the movies, it's slower, quieter, a fatting of small things, the way they hold your hand, the way they breathe, the way their eyes start to wander towards something you can't see. Sharon tried to pull him back with small talk. She told him about Kelly's latest idea for a show, about Jack's kids, about the roses in their garden, but he didn't respond much, just nodded, just smiled. And then out of nowhere he said, "Promise me you'll listen to what I leave." She thought he meant instructions, maybe medical documents, maybe even funeral stuff. Ozzy could be darkly practical when he wanted. But the way he said it, softer than she'd ever heard him, made her uneasy. That night she stayed by his bed until he fell asleep. His chest rose and fell with that ragged rhythm she'd memorized years ago, back when his body was already paying for the storms he'd put it through, decades of addiction, exhaustion, and pain. She kissed his forehead, whispered that she'd be right back, and stepped into the hallway. She didn't cry there. Sharon Osbourne doesn't cry where people can see. She waited until she was alone, sitting in her car, before she let it out. There's something cruel about love. You spend years fighting with someone, yelling, forgiving, rebuilding, and when you finally understand them, they start slipping away. Sharon had known Ozzy since he was chaos incarnate. The man who could set a room on fire with energy, who could terrify a hotel staff one minute and hug a crying fan the next. People called him the Prince of Darkness. But she knew the truth. He wasn't dark. He was just broken in ways the world couldn't see. She had spent half her life protecting him from that world, and sometimes from himself. And now, the man who'd once been unstoppable was whispering about leaving messages. That terrified her more than any overdose, any fight, any scandal ever had. A few nights later, the nurses said Ozzy wanted to see her privately. When she walked in, he was sitting upright for the first time in days, a notebook open in front of him. His handwriting was barely legible, shaking across the page. "Just notes," he said when she asked. "Lyrics, maybe," he smiled faintly. But his eyes told a different story. They were searching hers, almost memorizing her face, like he wanted to etch it into memory. She tried to brush it off. "You'll write a million more songs, darling. You're not going anywhere." He chuckled softly. "You always say that. And I always mean it." "I know," he said. "That's what scares me." That line stayed with her. She didn't even understand it then. But months later, when she heard the recording, it all clicked. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving her behind. In those weeks, Ozzy's energy came and went like waves. Some mornings, he'd joke with the nurses, tease Sharon, call her boss lady with that crooked grin. Other days, he barely spoke. One evening, she came in and found him wearing his headphones, head tilted, listening to something on his phone, tears in his eyes. "What are you listening to?" she asked. He took one headphone off, handed it to her. It was their wedding song, 1,000 Years. She laughed through her tears. "That's not even ours," he smirked. "It is now." He was planning something, she could feel it, but she didn't know what. Behind the scenes, Ozzy had called in one of his oldest studio engineers, a man named Tim Palmer. "I need to record something," he'd told him. "No music, no production, just me." The request surprised Tim, but he didn't question it. When Ozzy showed up to the small home studio 2 days later, his hands shook, but his eyes were clear. "Don't fix my voice," he said. "Let it sound how it is. It's gotta sound real." He recorded for nearly an hour, sometimes speaking, sometimes pausing, sometimes crying. Tim would later say it was the most intimate thing he'd ever witnessed, like watching someone pour out their soul while they still had one foot in the world. No one, not even Sharon, knew about it. The next morning, Ozzy was quieter than usual. He kept asking Sharon about old photos, where she'd stored their wedding album, the family tapes, even old backstage footage from the 80s. She thought maybe he wanted to organize things. She didn't realize he was preparing to leave pieces of himself behind. It's strange how people know when their time is near. They start closing circles, making peace, saying things in half sentences. That was Ozzy now, finishing stories she didn't know had started. Every night before she went home, she kissed his forehead and said, "You're coming home soon." And every night he whispered back, "I'll always be home." She didn't understand what he meant until later. On one particularly rough night, his breathing worsened. The doctors rushed in, voices overlapping, machines beeping faster. Sharon stood frozen, watching the man she'd built an empire with fade beneath fluorescent light. He made it through, barely. But something in him changed after that. The next day he was calm, almost peaceful, like someone who had finally accepted something. He asked Sharon to bring him his wedding ring. He'd stopped wearing it in the hospital because of swelling. She slipped it back on his finger and he held her hand for a long time. "You know I wasn't easy to love," he said. She laughed through tears. "That's the understatement of the century." "But you did it anyway," he murmured. "You stayed." "Of course I did." "Why?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Because you're mine." He smiled at that, a tired, grateful smile. Good answer. That night she caught him whispering to a nurse, asking if they could bring in a small recorder. "It's for therapy," he said. She didn't think much of it then. Ozzy was always doing strange things, little rituals to distract himself from pain. A week later, she walked into his hospital room and found his bed empty. Panic surged through her chest until she heard laughter from down the hall. There he was, sitting in the corridor, joking with another patient. His face pale but lit up, eyes shining like they used to when he'd step on stage. "You scared me," she said, clutching her chest. "Sorry, love," he replied. "Didn't mean to." Then, quieter, "Just needed to stretch my legs before the show." He always called life a show. Every day, another performance. But Sharon would later realize that night he wasn't talking about concerts. 3 days later, she came home to rest for a few hours. The house felt too big without him. She wandered through their living room, past gold records and family portraits. Every corner carried a memory, his laughter, his shouting, his songs echoing down the hall. She found herself standing in his office, staring at his desk. That's when she noticed it, an envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax. Her name written across the front in his unmistakable scrawl, for Sharon. Play alone. Her heart dropped. She didn't open it, not right away. She sat down on the floor and just stared at it. Her hands trembled. Part of her wanted to throw it away, pretend she hadn't seen it. Because opening it would mean admitting what she'd been trying to deny, that he was preparing to say goodbye. That envelope stayed unopened for days. She couldn't bring herself to do it. Every time she walked past his desk, her chest tightened. But eventually, curiosity, or maybe love, won. When she finally tore it open, she found a small USB drive inside, nothing else. She plugged it into her laptop and the screen flickered. A single file appeared, for Sharon. Her cursor hovered over it for what felt like hours, and then she clicked play. A familiar hum filled the room, followed by his voice, soft, rasped, but unmistakably Ozzy. Sharon, you saved my life more times than I can count. I don't know why you stayed when I gave you every reason not to, but you did, and that's how I know you're the only real thing I ever had. She gasped. The sound of him breathing, the tiny pauses between words, it felt like he was right there. If I don't make it home, he continued, don't cry for the monster they made me. Remember the man who tried to love you right at the end. Her tears came before the sentence finished. Her chest tightened. He'd always been the loud one, the wild one, the unbreakable one. But here in this recording he was small, human, afraid. She replayed it again and again, as if listening could somehow change the ending, as if the sound of his voice could bring him back. Outside, the sun was rising. The light poured through the curtains, spilling across the photographs on the wall of two kids who'd built an empire out of chaos. Sharon wiped her face, took a deep breath, and whispered, I heard you, darling. I heard you. And in that moment, surrounded by memories and silence, she realized something. The message wasn't just his goodbye. It was his way of saying he'd finally found peace. She didn't know it yet, but the world would soon hear a fragment of that message, and their hearts would break the same way hers did that morning. But for now, it was just her. The woman who'd loved a legend, sitting in the glow of dawn, listening to the last words of the only man who could ever truly break her heart. Before that message, before the hospital and the whispers of goodbye, there was a story that could fill a lifetime. A story of two people who should have destroyed each other, but didn't. The world knows Ozzy Osbourne as the madman of rock, the bat-biting legend, the chaos that couldn't be tamed. But behind every shattered guitar and every tabloid headline there was Sharon, watching, fighting, holding it all together when he couldn't. When they first met in the late 70s, Ozzy was already spiraling. Fired from Black Sabbath, drowning in his own addictions, broke and convinced his career was over. Sharon was young but sharp, the daughter of his former manager, someone who knew exactly how cruel the music industry could be. Everyone thought she was crazy for taking him on. He was a wreck, a risk no one wanted. But she saw something else. A spark buried under the chaos. A boy from Birmingham, who just needed someone to believe he was worth saving. Their partnership began as business, but it never stayed that way. She became his manager, his shield, and eventually his wife. And for a while it looked like she'd pulled off the impossible, reviving the career of a man everyone had written off. The early 80s became their battlefield and their victory lap all at once. Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, World Tour, screaming fans, Ozzy was back. But every night on stage came with a price. Off stage, he was slipping further away. There's a difference between loving a man and keeping him alive. Sharon learned that the hard way. Nights spent cleaning up after him, dragging him out of hotel rooms, begging him to stay sober long enough to make it through one more show. She was manager, nurse, wife, and warrior. He tell her he didn't deserve her. She tell him to shut up and take his meds. That was their love language, raw, brutal honesty wrapped in loyalty. Through it all, there were glimpses of the man the world never saw. The one who'd sit on the floor, playing with their kids, humming lullabies between gigs. The man who cried when he thought no one was watching. The man who once told her, "You make me want to live, even when I don't know how." That line would echo decades later when his health started to fade. But before that, they went through hell. Addiction, relapses, near-death moments that tested every vow they'd ever made. In 2003, the ATV accident almost took him. A broken neck, fractured ribs, internal bleeding. The doctors told Sharon he might not wake up. She stayed in that hospital for weeks, refusing to leave his side. When he finally opened his eyes, his first words weren't about pain or fear. He looked at her and said, "I thought I'd lost you." She laughed through tears and said, "You're the one who almost died, you idiot." That was them, tragedy wrapped in humor, chaos softened by love. They fought like fire and stayed like stone. Even when the world turned their marriage into a headline, they never stopped finding their way back to each other. There were betrayals, too. Ozzy's affairs nearly broke her. She left once. But when he begged for forgiveness, not as a rock star but as a broken man, she saw that same spark again. She came back, not because she forgot, but because she couldn't let their story end in bitterness. They rebuilt from ashes. Together, they raised a family, built empires, survived fame, mockery, and reality television. The cameras showed their arguments and their absurdity, but not the quiet nights, the ones where he'd rest his head on her shoulder and whisper, "Thank you for not giving up on me." So when the diagnosis came, Parkinson's, frailty, the slow unraveling of a body that had survived too much, it wasn't just another battle. It was the beginning of an ending they both felt coming. Ozzy once told a reporter, "If she ever leaves, I'm done. That's my heart walking out the door." But by then, they both knew the truth. One of them was going to have to say goodbye first. That's the backdrop behind the message he left. It wasn't the story of a rock legend. It was the story of two people who'd lived a lifetime on the edge and somehow found grace in the fall. Every scar, every relapse, every headline led to that final moment in the hospital. The message wasn't born out of fame. It was born out of everything they'd survived together, and the one thing he couldn't survive without her. Before the world ever heard that haunting final message, before the hospital walls and whispered goodbyes, there was the long, messy, magnificent story that built it. The story of a man who was supposed to die 1,000 times but somehow didn't. The story of a woman who refused to walk away, even when everyone told her she should. Ozzy and Sharon weren't just a marriage. They were a war, a prayer, and a miracle that somehow kept surviving itself. When Sharon first saw him, really saw him, not the rocker, not the myth, but the man, he was already falling apart. It was the late 70s. Black Sabbath had just let him go, and Ozzy was a ghost walking through London pubs, drunk before noon, high before sunset, carrying fame like a curse he couldn't put down. His eyes were red, his hands shaking, his voice slurred. But when he laughed, it still had that boyish ring of mischief, like the world hadn't crushed him completely yet. Most people saw him and thought lost cause, but Sharon didn't. Maybe because she'd grown up in that same circus of chaos. Maybe because she understood that broken men often hide the most brilliance. She took him on when no one else would. She told him, "You're not finished. Not yet." And he believed her, not because he saw it, but because she did. That's where it started, not with love, not with passion, but with belief. They built something out of the ashes. Sharon managed him, pushed him, screamed at him, and sometimes saved him from himself. While the rest of the industry rolled its eyes, she rebuilt his career brick by brick. Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, Flying High Again, songs born from the madness she helped him tame. Every show felt like defiance. Every tour a resurrection. But the higher they climbed, the darker the shadows got. Fame doesn't heal a wound like Ozzy's, it only makes it louder. There were nights when she'd find him on the bathroom floor, half-conscious, whispering apologies to no one. Mornings when he'd swear he'd quit, only to disappear into the fog again. He didn't mean to hurt her, but addiction doesn't care about intentions. It consumes everything, even love. And still she stayed. Not because it was easy, because somewhere deep down she knew he was fighting to come back. Sharon used to tell friends that Ozzy was two people, the man the world saw and the man she loved. The first was wild, untouchable, destructive. The second was soft, gentle, almost childlike in his need for warmth. She said once, he never really grew up, he just survived. Maybe that's why she couldn't leave. She'd seen the little boy hiding inside the monster, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. But survival doesn't come without scars. The tabloids made their pain entertainment. Fights, scandals, rehab stints, it was all public. Every heartbreak televised, every relapse written about like a movie plot. And through it all, they kept trying to hold on to something real. There were moments that made it worth it. Quiet dinners. Laughter so loud it made the kids cover their ears. The way Ozzy would look at her sometimes, like she was the only anchor keeping him from floating into the void. Then came the crash. The ATV accident in 2003 changed everything. One second he was in the yard riding for fun, the next he was crushed beneath the weight of his own machine, neck broken, lungs filling with blood. Sharon got the call in the middle of the night. They told her to prepare herself. She drove like a woman possessed, every mile filled with prayer and disbelief. When she reached the hospital, they wouldn't let her in at first. "He's critical," they said. She looked them straight in the eye and said, "He's my husband, I'm not leaving." For weeks she barely slept. She sat beside his bed, watching the man who had outscreamed death for decades lie silent, tubes in his throat, his body unrecognizable. Every beep from the monitor felt like a countdown. She would whisper in his ear, "You're not done, Ozzy, not yet." Sometimes she thought she saw his fingers twitch just slightly. Sometimes she thought she heard him mumble her name, but she couldn't be sure if it was real or if she just needed it to be. When he finally woke up, his first words were barely a whisper. "Am I dead?" She burst out laughing through tears. "Not yet, you stubborn bastard," he smiled weakly. "Guess I can't even die right." They both laughed then, the kind of laughter that only comes from surviving something you shouldn't have. But something inside her shifted. For the first time, she realized what life would be like without him, and she hated it. That accident was the first real confrontation with mortality. The moment when Ozzy realized the body that had carried him through decades of madness was breaking down for good. He recovered, but not completely. There were tremors, pain, fatigue. He tried to hide it on stage, but Sharon saw it every day. The man who once commanded arenas now needed help walking some mornings. He joked about it, calling himself the Tin Man. But there were nights she'd catch him staring at his hands, quietly mourning what they used to do. And yet the world kept spinning. The Osbournes' reality show made them household names again. Millions watched them argue, laugh, curse, and somehow love each other through it all. People thought it was chaos for entertainment, but Sharon knew better. It was their real life, messy and unfiltered, broadcast for everyone to see. There were days she hated it, the invasion, the exposure. But then she'd see the way fans connected. How they saw that even legends bleed. That even fame doesn't fix a marriage. It just exposes what's underneath. Through every scandal, every broken moment, there was still tenderness. Ozzy would surprise her with handwritten notes, clumsy little hearts drawn in the margins. Once, he showed up at her hotel room after a fight, holding a stuffed bat and saying, "Don't worry, love, I won't bite this one." She rolled her eyes, but she smiled, because even in madness, he made her laugh. But love doesn't erase the cracks, it just helps you live with them, and there were plenty. Infidelity nearly ended them more than once. When she discovered one affair years later, she said she felt her heart physically break. She threw him out, told him she was done. For weeks they didn't speak. The world thought it was over, but then he called her, his voice wrecked. "You're my everything, Sharon, I can't breathe without you." And she believed him, not because the words were perfect, but because the pain in them was real. She went back, not out of weakness, but out of love. The kind of love that isn't pretty, but it's true. There's something almost holy about surviving what should have destroyed you. They found their rhythm again, older, slower, wiser. Sharon began managing his medication schedules, his appointments, his diet, every detail of his fragile new world. And still he'd make her laugh with something ridiculous. "If I die," he told her once, "make sure they bury me with my eyeliner on." She threw a pillow at him. "Don't even joke like that." But he wasn't joking. He knew something she didn't want to admit yet. His body was losing the fight. Then came the Parkinson's diagnosis. January 2020. Sharon sat beside him on the TV couch when he announced it to the world. His voice cracked as he said, "I've been diagnosed with a mild form of Parkinson's. It's been a struggle." She held his hand the whole time, squeezing every few seconds, grounding him. To everyone watching, it was another rock star revelation. But to her, it was a death sentence written in slow motion. Behind closed doors, he became quieter, more reflective. He watched old videos of himself performing, jumping, spinning, alive, and just stare. "I can't do that anymore," he'd whisper. Sharon would kiss his cheek and say, "You've done enough for 10 lifetimes." But he'd just shake his head. "Not for you." That's what people never understood about them. The music, the fame, the madness. It was never really about legacy. It was about love. Every note he sang, every fight they survived, every apology whispered at 3 in the morning, it was all for her. As his health declined, he started recording again, not albums but thoughts. Little audio notes on his phone, sometimes about music, sometimes about life. Once she caught him mumbling into the mic, "I've done a lot wrong, but she made me right." She didn't say anything. She just stood there, silently listening, tears sliding down her face. By that point, Sharon had become more caretaker than wife. Their love had shifted into something quieter but deeper, no longer built on adrenaline, but on gratitude. He'd look at her with that mischievous grin, and she'd see not the prince of darkness, but the man she met decades ago, the lost soul who just wanted someone to stay. And maybe that's why, when he began talking about leaving messages, she didn't stop him. Maybe she already knew what he was trying to do, because their entire story had been one long goodbye disguised as a love story. The world saw chaos, but she saw a lifetime of second chances, and every one of those moments, every crash, every heartbreak, every tear, was leading to that final message he left for her. A message that wasn't just about death. It was the closing line of a song they'd been writing together for 40 years. Before the message, before the whisper that broke her heart, there was a whole lifetime of chaos, fire, and love that no one else could have survived. Sharon used to say that loving Ozzy was like holding lightning, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to let go of once it hit you. And maybe that's what kept them together when every sane person would have walked away. Because what they had wasn't normal love. It was the kind that ruins you and saves you at the same time. When they met, Ozzy was already drifting between fame and self-destruction. The world saw a legend, but Sharon saw a man who didn't know how to live outside of noise. He was lost, wild-eyed, and unpredictable, like a storm that didn't know where to land. He'd just been kicked out of Black Sabbath, his band, his family. The rejection crushed him. He locked himself in hotel rooms for days, drinking, losing himself in bottles and smoke. But that was the moment Sharon stepped in. She didn't flinch at the chaos, she walked straight into it. She told him, "You're not finished, you're just beginning." And somehow he believed her. Their love wasn't born out of romance. It was born out of survival. She became his manager first, handling deals, taking calls, pushing promoters to give the crazy drunk another chance. But somewhere between the paperwork and the late-night phone calls, something deeper started forming. They understood each other's darkness. Hers came from growing up under her father's ruthless world of music business manipulation. His came from poverty, addiction, and a lifetime of being told he wasn't enough. Together they found something like peace. Loud, messy peace, but peace nonetheless. By 1980, Ozzy had clawed his way back into the spotlight. Sharon built his career with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a woman who refused to lose. Crazy Train hit like a bomb. Audiences screamed his name again. The man who everyone said was finished suddenly became immortal. But behind the curtain, the price of that resurrection was steep. Ozzy was living fast again, always one relapse away from disaster. Sharon traveled with him everywhere, half manager, half guardian angel. Every city was another battle, another night of drinking, another phone call that began with, "You need to come quick." People thought she was cold, but they didn't see the nights she spent dragging him back to bed, whispering to him to just breathe. They didn't see the mornings she'd find him sitting on the floor, crying like a child, saying, "I don't deserve you." She'd hold his face and whisper, "You don't have to, just live." There were moments when he'd disappear for days, gone without a word. She'd call everyone, search every hotel, every dive bar until she found him. He'd look up at her through the blur of drugs and exhaustion and say, "You shouldn't have come." And she'd reply, "That's what you said last time and I'm still here." That was their rhythm: crash, rebuild, repeat. It was toxic at times, but it was also real. Neither of them were built for soft love. They were two broken edges that somehow fit together. Sharon used to say, "We fight like animals, but we love like them too, fierce and without logic." And Ozzy would grin, that crooked grin that made her melt, and say, "You're the only thing louder than me." But fame doesn't forgive easily. The tabloids loved their chaos. Every argument became a headline, every bruise a rumor. Yet through the noise, their children were growing up watching the most public marriage in rock history somehow not fall apart. There were betrayals, ones the world later learned about, but back then they stayed hidden behind closed doors. She confronted him once, voice shaking, eyes full of fury and heartbreak. "Why do you do this to me?" she cried. He stared at her like a man cornered by his own mistakes. "Because I'm scared of losing you." That kind of confession doesn't fix things, but it softens them. She didn't forgive him overnight, but she never stopped loving him. Love for Sharon wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a decision. Every morning she chose him again, even when it hurt. Then came 2003, the year that changed everything. The day started normal, laughter, coffee, chaos in the backyard. Ozzy loved riding his ATV. It gave him a sense of freedom he couldn't find anywhere else. He'd been feeling better, more stable, more alive. Sharon was in London filming her talk show when she got the call. The words came fast, broken, unreal. "Ozzy's had an accident. It's bad." She flew home on the first plane she could get, her heart pounding like a drum the entire way. When she walked into that hospital, everything froze. Ozzy was on a ventilator, pale and broken, tubes everywhere, his chest rising only because machines were forcing it to. The doctors said, "He might not make it through the night." She didn't cry then. She just took his hand and whispered, "You can't leave me, not like this. Not after everything." For 8 days she barely moved. Nurses would find her asleep in the chair beside him, her hand never leaving his. She prayed, something she hadn't done in years. "Take anything, just not him," she begged. And when he finally opened his eyes, she broke. He smiled weakly, whispering through the oxygen tube, "You're still here," she laughed through tears. "Of course. Where else would I go?" He survived, again, and something changed after that. The man who had spent decades running from death started slowing down, as if realizing he couldn't outrun it forever. Sharon noticed it, the way he watched sunsets longer, the way he spoke softer to their kids, the way he'd say, "I love you," without needing to be drunk or joking. He started writing again, not songs, but thoughts, scraps of paper left on her pillow. "Thank you for staying. You're my favorite reason for being alive." She kept them all in a drawer. But the peace didn't last. The years that followed brought new challenges. Age, exhaustion, and the toll of every bad choice began to surface. His hands shook more. His memory slipped. He'd start sentences he couldn't finish. And then came the day Sharon will never forget, the diagnosis: Parkinson's. He took it quietly. She didn't. She screamed, cursed, cried, Haven't you suffered enough?" He just sat there holding her hand. "It's just another thing, love, we'll get through it." But even he knew this wasn't just another thing. This time the battle wasn't with fame or addiction. It was with his own body. There were days when the disease felt merciless. Sharon would walk into their room and find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "They don't listen to me anymore," he said once, voice cracking. She hugged him from behind, whispering, "Then I'll listen for both of us." The public didn't see that side. They saw the interviews, the jokes, the brave face. But behind the cameras, it was heartbreak disguised as strength. He began canceling shows. Every cancellation was a wound. "I don't want to be remembered as a broken man," he told her one night. "Then don't be," she said. "Be remembered as a fighter." And he did try. He still sang, even if only for her. Late nights in the living room, he'd hum old melodies. His voice was weaker, but the emotion was deeper than ever. Once, after finishing a quiet version of "Mama, I'm Coming Home," he looked at her and said, "That song was never about fans. It was always about you." She didn't answer. She just reached for his hand and held it tight. Through all of it, Sharon never stopped believing he'd somehow cheat death again, the way he always did. But Ozzy knew better. He'd seen too many close calls. He felt the fragility creeping in, the way his breath shortened, the way his energy faded faster. And that's when the idea of the message began forming in his mind. A parting gift, not for the fans or the world, but for her. In the last years before the recording, their relationship softened in ways neither expected. The fights grew rarer. The silence became comfortable. They spend evenings just sitting together, hands intertwined, watching old concerts on TV. Sometimes she'd tease him, "You look like hell there." He'd chuckle, "Still got more hair than you, though." She'd smack him lightly, pretending to be annoyed, but inside she was just grateful to still have moments like that. One night she caught him staring at her a little too long. "What?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "You haven't changed," she laughed. "I've changed plenty." "Not to me," he whispered. "To me, you're still the girl who walked into that bar and told me I wasn't finished." That was the thing about Ozzy. Beneath the madness, he remembered everything that mattered. He never forgot the night she saved his life, or the time she dragged him out of the dark when no one else cared, or the way she'd hold his face when he was lost and say, "You're still here. That's enough." Looking back now, it all makes sense. The message he left wasn't a last-minute act of sentimentality. It was years in the making. Every apology, every "I love you," every moment of silence between them was leading to it. It was his way of making sure she'd never feel alone again, even when he was gone. Before his health declined completely, he asked her one night, "Do you think people can hear us after we're gone?" She smiled sadly. "I think love can," he nodded slowly. "Then I'm not scared." That was the heart of their story. Not the fame, not the chaos. Just two people battered by life who never stopped finding each other through the noise. The message he left behind wasn't just a farewell. It was the final verse of a song that began the moment she said, "You're not done yet." And even after the last note fades, that echo, the echo of everything they were, still lingers in the quiet. And that's the thing about love like theirs. It doesn't end when the body gives out. It lingers in the spaces between memories, in the way she still talks about him in the present tense. Sharon once said she still hears his voice when the house is too quiet. Not in a ghostly way, but in that familiar, comforting tone that used to fill every room. "You all right, love?" she imagines him saying. And she answers every time, "Yeah, I'm all right." Because Ozzy didn't really leave her. He left reminders, scribbled notes in drawers, half-finished lyrics on the piano, and that message, the one that broke her and healed her all at once. The one where he said, "Don't let them turn our story into a tragedy. Tell them we made it." She did. She still is. If you listen closely to her interviews now, you'll hear it in her voice. The steadiness of a woman who's been through storms and came out still loving the thunder. Ozzy's legacy isn't just the music, the madness, or the myth. It's the love that refused to quit. The kind that forgives, rebuilds, and outlasts everything, even death. So if you've ever loved someone through their chaos, if you've ever chosen to stay when walking away seemed easier, then you already understand them. Because that's what Ozzy's final message was really about. Not goodbye, but gratitude. Not ending, but endurance. And maybe that's why the world still listens. Because deep down, we're all just hopping to find what they found, to be loved not for our perfection, but for our persistence. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes in forever, even when forever hurts. Subscribe for more true stories of love, loss, and legacy. Because somewhere out there, another legend's heart is still beating through the people who refuse to let it die. And as Ozzy himself once said, with that crooked grin and that unmistakable voice, "The show must go on, love, but make sure they never forget who we were."